No one cared to ask her name. They noticed only the gray of her uniform and the quiet way she moved through the grand dining room, as if she were a shadow trained to disappear at will. The room was heavy with scents of roasted lamb and polished wood, the perfume of a wealthy home holding court before an audience of its own. Crystal chimed, laughter rose and fell like tides, until a single voice cut across it all with the finality of glass breaking. "Come here." The command came from Eleanor Whitford, seated in her silk gown of emerald green, her smile sharpened into a weapon. Around the table, forks hovered mid-air. Conversation froze. Every guest turned toward the woman standing at the far side of the table. The young housemaid, Isabel Moreno, paused with a plate balanced in her hands, then set it down carefully. Her pulse pressed hot against her throat. She walked forward, her shoes soundless on the rug, her back straight despite the sudden heaviness of eyes tracking her. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. Candlelight caught the sequins stitched into her dress, throwing sparks across the dark paneled walls. Her voice was honey over steel. "Stand here." Isabel obeyed, her expression still, her silence absolute. In 8 months of service, she had learned that silence was safer than words. She folded her hands in front of her, the faint scent of lemons from polished silver clinging to her skin. At the far end of the table sat Henry Whitford, master of the house, his dark hair silvered at the edges, his jaw set tight. He said nothing, but the stillness in his body was louder than speech. Around him, the guests waited. Men of finance, women of lineage, all wrapped in the shimmer of wealth. Eleanor circled Isabel as though she were an exhibit. Her heels clicked softly against the parquet floor, each step deliberate. "Our help," she said to the room, voice pitched to Carrie, "sometimes forgets her place." The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Ripples of discomfort passed through the gathering. A woman shifted in her seat, her pearls clinking against crystal. A man coughed softly, his eyes darting away. Isabel's shoulders stiffened, though she did not speak. Her uniform was clean, pressed, without flaw. She had spent hours polishing, pressing, arranging, yet she stood accused of something unnamed. Eleanor reached out suddenly. With the practiced precision of cruelty, her manicured fingers hooked the collar of Isabel's blouse. The cotton strained, then split with a sharp tearing sound that cracked through the room. Gasps spread like wind in dry grass. Candle flames trembled. The rip revealed pale fabric beneath, the intimate flash of an underslip. Isabel flinched, clutching the tear closed with both hands, her face paling, her breath shallow and ragged. Silence smothered the room. Guests stared at their plates, their glasses, anywhere but the young woman standing in humiliation at the center. Isabel's chin lifted an inch, though her hands shook. She would not cry here. Not before them. From the threshold came a small, unsteady voice. "Mother?" A girl of 12 stood in the doorway, clutching a sketchbook to her chest. Clara Whitford had slipped from her room, drawn by the sharpness of voices. Now her wide gray eyes searched the scene, confusion shadowing her young face. Eleanor froze for a moment, her triumph flickering under her daughter's gaze. She drew breath as if to recover, but before words could leave her, a chair scraped against stone. The sound thundered through the silence. Henry Whitford rose from his seat. He was a tall man, his frame carrying the weight of authority long practiced. He moved with deliberate steadiness, each step echoing in the hush. The eyes of every guest followed him, waiting. He stopped in front of Isabel, removed his black dinner jacket with slow precision, and draped it across her shoulders. The gesture was protective, unarguable. His hand lingered there, steadying her trembling form. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner. "What you have done tonight," he said, turning toward his wife, "is beneath this house, and it is beneath you." Gasps spread again, sharper this time. A collective intake of air filled the chamber, followed by the weight of stillness heavier than stone. Eleanor's face drained of color, her mouth shaping words that refused to form. The guests sat frozen, suspended between fascination and horror. Clara stepped forward, her small voice shaking, but clear. "She helps me with my lessons." The words, fragile and unvarnished, broke the tension like a blade through silk. Some guests looked down in shame. Others shifted uneasily, their fine clothing suddenly tight against their skin. The child's declaration exposed the cruelty laid bare before them. Eleanor's hand trembled against the polished table. She searched for composure but found none. The room, once her stage, had turned. Judgment no longer shone from her, but upon her. Isabel stood wrapped in the jacket, the scent of cologne and cedar clinging to its lining. Her tears burned unshed, but her chin held firm. For a moment, she felt something shift, an invisible current running beneath the silence. It was not triumph. It was not safety. It was the beginning of something neither she nor the Whitford family could yet name. But everyone in that room, every guest, every servant, every soul present, understood that the balance of power inside these walls had cracked. And through that fracture, something unstoppable was about to emerge. The dining room had not recovered. Candles still burned in their holders, but their light felt harsh now, exposing what had just taken place. Guests sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes darting between Henry Whitford and his wife, unsure whether to rise or remain. The smell of roasted lamb and wine lingered in the air, but appetites had vanished. Isabel stood motionless in the dinner jacket, her hands clutching the lapels as if they were armor. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. She wanted to fade into the walls, to vanish back into the quiet labor that had defined her life. But she could not. She had been pulled into the center of this house, and everyone knew it. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. She had spent years mastering the art of the cutting remark, the gesture that wounded without drawing blood. But now her husband's rebuke hung in the air like a verdict, and her daughter's innocent defense had stripped away the last veil of her superiority. Her carefully constructed identity trembled on its foundation. Henry turned to the table, his voice calm but firm. "Our evening is concluded. I thank you for your presence, but I will not allow this house to play host to cruelty." There was a pause, and then the movement of chairs. Men stood awkwardly. Wives gathered their shawls. Polite murmurs filled the space as guests attempted to smooth the rough edges of departure. One by one, they filed toward the great double doors, each carrying with them a memory they would not easily discard. Some offered Isabel quick, almost guilty glances of sympathy. Others kept their eyes down, unwilling to confront the unease in their own silence. Dr. Bennett, a silver-haired banker with a reputation for severity, stopped at Isabel's side. He cleared his throat, voice low. "What you endured tonight was undeserved. If you ever need assistance, you may call on me." He slipped a card into her hand, his gesture hurried but sincere. Then he was gone, swallowed into the departing crowd. Eleanor remained rooted at the head of the table. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing against her skin like heat. For the first time in years, she was not the admired hostess, but the figure everyone whispered about as they crossed the marble threshold. Clara lingered in the doorway, her sketchbook clutched tightly. She looked from her father to Isabel, then back to her mother. Her young voice carried a tremor of disappointment. "Why did you do that?" Eleanor closed her eyes but offered no reply. She could not explain envy to a child. She could not name the fear that had coiled inside her, the fear of losing control, of being replaced not by a rival of status, but by the dignity of someone unseen. Henry placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Go upstairs, Clara. I will speak with you later." The girl hesitated, her gaze holding Isabel's for a moment, Then she obeyed, retreating slowly up the staircase. Her footsteps were soft but steady, leaving behind an echo that cut Eleanor more deeply than any accusation. The house was quieter now, stripped of its audience. Only 3 remained in the cavernous dining hall: Henry, Eleanor, and Isabel. The torn fabric at Isabel's collar peeked out from beneath the jacket. She gripped it as though it might tether her to the ground. "Mr. Whitford," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps I should leave. This is a family matter." Henry's eyes softened, though his voice remained unyielding. "You are part of what happened tonight, and you will not bear the blame for it." Eleanor finally spoke, her tone brittle. "So you mean to defend her over your wife? In front of strangers you humiliate me, and now you elevate the help above me?" Henry's gaze was steady, his words measured. "I defended decency. Nothing more." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Isabel shifted, desperate to escape the weight of their quarrel, but Henry raised a hand gently to still her. He turned to his wife, his voice low but unflinching. "This house has survived because we built it on respect. You forgot that tonight." Eleanor's hands trembled where they gripped the back of her chair. She wanted to lash out, to reclaim her authority, but the certainty that had fueled her cruelty was gone. She looked at Isabel, saw the tears shining in her eyes but not falling, saw the steadiness in her stance despite the humiliation, and something inside her faltered. Without another word, Eleanor swept from the room, her gown whispering against the floor as she disappeared into the shadowed corridor. The silence she left behind was vast. Henry stood beside Isabel, his expression unreadable. He removed a folded handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. She accepted it with hesitant fingers, pressing the fabric against her face. "I am sorry," he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "What happened tonight should never have occurred under this roof." Isabel lowered the handkerchief. "It was not your fault." But Henry shook his head. "Silence is fault enough." The words struck Isabel more deeply than she expected. She had spent her life believing silence was her only protection. Now, hearing it condemned, she felt something stir within her. A question, a possibility she had never dared to entertain. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, its chime reverberating through the chamber. Isabel straightened her posture, adjusting the jacket around her shoulders. She no longer felt invisible. She felt exposed, fragile, but also strangely seen. Henry guided her gently toward the side door, away from the remnants of shattered civility. As they moved, Isabel caught her reflection in the tall mirror that loomed over the sideboard. She barely recognized the woman staring back, her dark hair unpinned, her uniform torn, a fine coat draped across her shoulders like borrowed dignity. At the threshold, she paused, her voice trembling. "What will happen now?" Henry met her eyes. "Now. Nothing can remain as it was." Isabel stepped into the hallway, her mind reeling. Upstairs, Clara sat awake with her sketchbook, pressing pencil to paper, capturing not flowers or faces but the jagged lines of something broken. And in the drawing, as in the house itself, Isabel's figure stood at the center. The night had ended, but its silence carried forward. In that silence, the balance of the Whitford home shifted. And within Isabel, a seed of change began to take root. Fragile, unsteady, but alive. Morning came with a thin gray light that spread slowly across the Whitford estate. Dew clung to the manicured hedges, and the stone steps of the veranda glistened as if the house itself had been washed clean overnight. Yet the air inside carried no freshness. The silence of the previous evening lingered in the halls, heavy as dust. Isabel rose early, as she always did. She tied her hair into a knot, pressed the torn uniform against her chest for a moment, and folded it carefully into a drawer. The dinner jacket Henry had given her still held the faint scent of cedar and smoke. She could not bring herself to return it yet. Instead, she hung it inside the wardrobe where no one else would see. In the kitchen, the cook, Mrs. Porter, stood kneading bread with strong, practiced hands. She looked up as Isabel entered. The older woman's eyes lingered on her, soft with concern. "Word travels fast," she murmured. "I heard the way Mrs. Whitford carried on last night." "You should not have been made to endure that." Isabel lowered her gaze. "It is finished now." But Mrs. Porter shook her head. "No, child. Nothing is finished after such a spectacle. You may not see it yet, but the ground under this house has shifted." The words unsettled Isabel, though she tried to steady herself by pouring water into the copper kettle. The clatter of metal against stone seemed louder than usual. She wondered if the guests from the night before were already whispering in their townhouses, passing judgment over coffee. By mid-morning, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching her sketchbook. Her gray eyes were shadowed, her voice hesitant. "Can I sit with you?" Isabel nodded. The girl climbed onto a stool, watching as Isabel sliced fruit with careful hands. Clara opened her sketchbook, revealing a drawing made in dark pencil strokes. The figures were unmistakable: a woman in a torn uniform, another in a shimmering gown, and a tall man draping a jacket over fragile shoulders. Isabel's breath caught. "You drew this?" Clara looked down at the page. "I could not forget it. Mama says I should not talk about it, but I keep hearing the sound of the fabric tearing. It is like it will not leave my ears." Isabel touched the child's hair gently, unsure how to comfort her. "Some sounds stay with us longer than they should, but they do not have to define us." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "You are not going to leave, are you?" The question struck Isabel like a plea. She hesitated, aware that Eleanor might yet demand her dismissal, but she forced her voice steady. "I will stay as long as I am allowed." Clara's shoulders eased. She leaned against Isabel's arm, the trust of a child weighing heavier than any accusation. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, Eleanor paced before the tall windows. Her reflection in the glass appeared ghostly, her hair falling loose from the pins she had driven into it the night before. She could still feel the eyes of the guests, the weight of her husband's words. Beneath the shame, anger smoldered. She told herself she had acted to protect her family, her marriage, her place in the world. Yet her daughter's disappointed eyes haunted her more than any disapproving guest. Henry entered quietly, but Eleanor turned on him, her voice sharp. "Do you know what you have done? You humiliated me in front of every influential family we know." Henry remained calm. "I did not humiliate you. You did that yourself." The words landed with a force that made Eleanor's chest tighten. She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "You defend her as though she is more than she is." Henry's reply was simple. "She is human. That is enough." For a long moment they stood in silence, two figures separated by more than the width of the room. Finally, Henry spoke again, his tone softer. "Eleanor, if you let envy consume you, this house will collapse. Clara sees more clearly than either of us. Do not force her to grow up believing cruelty is strength." Eleanor pressed her hand against the cold glass, staring out at the grounds below. She could not answer. Her pride clashed with something deeper, something fragile and unspoken. Later that afternoon, Isabel was sent into town with a list of errands. She walked the narrow streets, the hem of her skirt brushing against her shoes, her basket balanced on one arm. The market was alive with noise, vendors calling, horses stamping, the smell of smoke and bread mingling in the air. Yet she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Two women near the milliner's shop paused their conversation as Isabel passed. Their whispers were not loud, but she caught fragments. "Whitford dinner. Disgraceful. The maid." Heat rose to her face. She walked faster, wishing for invisibility, but the story had already slipped beyond her control. At the butcher's stall, an older man with weathered hands handed her the parcel of meat and said quietly, "You held your head high, child. Not many could have." His words startled her, not because of kindness, but because he knew. The humiliation she had tried to contain inside the Whitford home was now public property. When Isabel returned to the estate, the sky was deepening toward dusk. She crossed the gardens where lanterns flickered against the oncoming dark. Inside, she found Clara waiting by the staircase, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. "Papa says tomorrow will be different," Clara whispered. Isabel crouched down, meeting the girl's eyes. "How so?" Clara's lips curved into something between hope and fear. "He says we must face what happened, not hide from it." The words unsettled Isabel. She had survived by hiding, by swallowing her voice, by bending her back in silence. To face what had happened felt dangerous, as though stepping into a storm with no shelter. Yet a part of her long dormant stirred. Night settled heavy over the house. From her small attic room, Isabel gazed out at the gardens, the stars blurred behind thin clouds. The jacket still hung in her wardrobe, its weight a constant reminder. She touched the torn seam of her uniform, the fabric frayed beneath her fingertips. Something had changed within her. She did not yet know what it was, but she could feel it pressing against the life she had always known. In the great bedroom below, Henry stood at the window, staring into the dark. Eleanor lay in silence, her face turned away. Between them stretched a gulf wider than the room itself. Both carried the memory of torn fabric and spoken words. And in the attic above, Isabel whispered to herself, though no one heard, "Nothing can remain as it was." The house slept uneasily, but the story had only begun to move. The Whitford estate stood in the pale glow of Sunday morning, its stone walls glistening with dew, as if the house itself longed to be cleansed. Inside, the air was tense, a quiet that carried more weight than words. The servants moved with lowered voices, careful footsteps, as though sound itself might awaken the embers still smoldering from Thursday night's storm. Isabel began her work as she always had, dusting, polishing, arranging. Yet each task felt altered, charged with a fragile awareness. She could feel the change in how others looked at her. Mrs. Porter, the cook, spoke with more warmth, while Thomas the gardener offered nods of respect that had not existed before. It was as if the torn uniform had exposed more than fabric. It had revealed her humanity to those who had chosen not to see. By mid-morning, Henry Whitford summoned her to the library. The heavy oak doors stood open, the scent of leather-bound volumes filling the air. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, catching dust motes in slow suspension. Isabel entered cautiously, smoothing the skirt of her fresh uniform, her heart quickened by the silence. Henry looked up from his desk. Papers lay spread before him, but his hands rested still. "Thank you for coming," he said. His tone was measured, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of unease or mimi. Isabel folded her hands. "What would you have of me, sir?" He studied her a moment. "I need to know if you wish to remain here. After what was done to you, no one would question your departure." The thought unsettled her. Leaving meant freedom from humiliation, but it also meant abandoning the fragile thread of dignity she had gained. "I will stay," she answered softly, "if I am permitted." Henry nodded. Relief flickered briefly across his features. "Then you will not be touched again. I give you my word." Before Isabel could reply, the door creaked open. Eleanor stood in the threshold, her figure framed by light. She had dressed with perfection, her hair pinned, her gown immaculate, but her eyes betrayed the sleeplessness of the night. "I see you have found new company for your mornings," she said, her voice edged with frost. Henry rose. "Eleanor, this is not the time." She ignored him, stepping closer. It never seems to be the time when it comes to her. Her gaze fixed on Isabel, sharp as glass. Tell me, what do you think you are becoming in this house? You imagine that one act of pity elevates you? Isabel felt her throat tighten, but she did not lower her eyes. I think only of my work, madam. Work, Eleanor echoed bitterly. Work that has ensnared my daughter, softened my husband, and turned my home into a stage for gossip. She looked at Henry, her voice rising. Do you not hear them, the whispers in town? Already they say the Whitfords cannot govern their own household, that we are undone by a servant. Henry's jaw tightened. Let them whisper. Truth will outlast rumor. Eleanor's laugh was brittle. Truth? Or the story they prefer to believe? Her eyes darted to Isabel again. You will learn, girl, that perception destroys more lives than lies ever could. The words struck Isabel like a chill. She knew the weight of whispers, had carried them her whole life. Yet standing here beneath Eleanor's scorn and Henry's defense, she felt the strange tension of a choice forming. A choice about silence, about voice, about how long she would remain unseen. The library door slammed as Eleanor departed, her perfume lingering like smoke after fire. Henry exhaled, long and weary. You must not take her words into yourself. But Isabel knew she already had. Later that afternoon, she accompanied Clara on a walk through the gardens. The girl carried her sketchbook as always, her boots crunching softly on gravel paths. They paused near the fountain where water spilled over marble angels worn smooth by time. Papa says things will change, Clara murmured, drawing absent circles on her paper. Isabel knelt beside her. Change can be frightening. Clara's eyes lifted. But sometimes frightening things make people stronger. The simplicity of the child's wisdom startled Isabel. She realized Clara had witnessed more than she had spoken. Children, after all, carried truths adults tried to bury. As dusk fell, the estate hosted a smaller gathering. Just a few close associates Henry could not offend by refusal. Isabel worked quietly at the edges of the room, serving wine, clearing glasses. She felt the sting of eyes upon her, though no one spoke. Conversations shifted when she entered, softened when she passed. Mr. Alden, a portly merchant with a booming voice, remarked to his neighbor just loud enough for her to hear, The Whitfords ought to choose their company more carefully. Respect once lost is not easily regained. Isabel's hand trembled as she lifted a tray, but she kept her eyes down, her movements steady. She understood now what Eleanor had meant. Perception was a blade sharper than cruelty itself. When the evening ended, Henry dismissed her with a nod of gratitude, but Isabel climbed to her small attic room carrying a weight that no words could lighten. She sat at her desk, the torn uniform folded neatly before her. She touched the ragged seam with careful fingers, remembering the sound of it tearing, the silence that followed. Something within her whispered that this was more than humiliation. It was revelation. She was not invisible any longer, and being seen, though dangerous, carried its own power. Downstairs, Eleanor sat alone in the dim parlor, a glass of wine untouched at her side. She stared into the darkened fireplace, her reflection faint in the window. She could still hear the murmurs from town, the pity disguised as politeness. For the first time, fear pricked her heart. Not fear of Isabel, but of losing the image she had spent a lifetime perfecting. And Henry, in the solitude of his study, read through letters that warned of business partners withdrawing, clients hesitating. Respectability was currency, and the household's fracture had begun to cost him dearly. The Whitford estate, for all its stone and grandeur, now stood on fault lines unseen. And in the stillness of the night, each inhabitant felt the tremor of what was to come. By Monday, the town was alive with whispers. The Whitford name, once spoken with reverence, now carried a note of scandal. In the market stalls, in the pews of the small chapel, in the smoke-filled corners of the tavern, people repeated the story in fragments. A dinner party undone, a uniform torn, a servant humiliated. The truth bent in every telling, but the shape of disgrace remained the same. Isabel felt it as soon as she entered the baker's shop. The bell above the door jingled, the smell of warm bread wrapping around her, but the conversation hushed. Two women near the counter looked her over from bonnet to shoes, their mouths pressed into thin lines. The baker's wife forced a smile, though her eyes slid quickly away. Isabel lowered her gaze, collected the loaves, and placed coins on the counter with careful hands. Outside, she breathed in the sharp winter air. It cut her lungs like glass, but it steadied her. She had lived with whispers her entire life. Poverty had its own chorus of judgment, but this felt different. The Whitford name was now tethered to hers, and she could not untangle herself no matter how she tried. Back at the estate, Clara ran to meet her, clutching a folded sheet of paper. "I drew something for you," she said, her eyes alight with a fragile kind of pride. Isabel unfolded it. The drawing showed a woman standing on a narrow bridge, water rushing beneath. On one side loomed a dark shadow shaped like Eleanor. On the other stood Henry, tall but distant. The figure on the bridge was small, but her head was lifted high. Isabel's throat tightened. "You are very brave to draw this." Clara shrugged. "It is only what I see." The girl's honesty unsettled Isabel. Children, she thought, cut through pretense with the blunt edge of truth. Later that day, Henry received a letter delivered by hand. The seal belonged to one of his oldest associates, Mr. Calder, a man whose approval carried weight in every boardroom. Henry broke the wax and read in silence. His face remained calm, but his hand tightened around the page. The letter was courteous, almost apologetic, yet its message was unmistakable. Calder would be withdrawing from an investment, citing concerns about recent rumors regarding the stability of the Whitford household. Henry folded the paper with precision, but inside him something hardened. Silence, he realized, was no longer protection. It was erosion. Meanwhile, Eleanor withdrew further into herself. She no longer lingered in parlors or accepted visits from friends. Curtains remained drawn, and she spent hours seated before her mirror, as though the reflection might explain what had gone wrong. When the servants passed her door, they heard only the faint clink of glass or the restless pacing of footsteps. One evening, Isabel was sent to deliver tea to the mistress's chambers. She entered quietly, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Eleanor sat by the window, her profile etched against the fading light. She did not turn as Isabel set the tray on the table. "Do you pity me?" Eleanor asked suddenly. The question startled Isabel. "No, madam." Eleanor's voice was low, almost fragile. "You should. A woman who built her life upon appearances cannot survive once those appearances crack." She turned then, her eyes sharp despite the pallor of her face. "You have undone me." Isabel's lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to protest, to say she had done nothing but her work, but the weight of accusation silenced her. She bowed her head, retreating quickly from the room. In her attic chamber that night, Isabel lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. The words clung to her. Had she undone Eleanor? Or had Eleanor undone herself? The line blurred, but guilt pressed heavy on her chest all the same. The following week, Henry called for Isabel again, this time not in the library but in his office downtown. She entered the space hesitantly. The office was filled with the smell of ink and tobacco, the walls lined with ledgers and maps of trade routes. Henry gestured for her to sit. "You may wonder why I asked you here," he began. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried exhaustion. "The events of that night have reached further than this family. Business partners hesitate. Invitations are rescinded, and all of it tied, unjustly, to you." Isabel's pulse quickened. "If my leaving would restore your standing, I will go." Henry shook his head. "No. You should not bear the burden of another's cruelty. But understand this. Silence has a cost. If we say nothing, the whispers decide the story. If we speak, perhaps the truth may find its way through. She stared at him, uncertain. And what would you have me say? Henry leaned forward. Not now. But one day you may have to speak. Not just for yourself, but for this house. The thought terrified her. She had survived by silence, by folding herself into corners where judgment could not find her. To speak was to risk everything. Yet part of her, the part awakened by Clara's trust, wondered if voice might hold its own kind of power. That evening, she returned to the estate under a darkening sky. The lamps in the hall glowed softly, casting long shadows on the polished floors. As she climbed the stairs, she paused at the sound of Clara's voice drifting from behind a door. "She will not leave, will she?" the girl asked softly. Henry's reply was low, but Isabel caught the words. "Not if I can help it." Isabel closed her eyes. The words should have comforted her, but instead, they left her trembling. To stay meant more than service now. It meant stepping into a conflict that was no longer hidden. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. Inside, the Whitford house braced itself against storms both whispered and real. And Isabel, caught between silence and speech, felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once more. Sunday bells tolled across town, their sound rolling over rooftops and echoing through the narrow streets. The Whitford carriage stood polished and waiting, its black lacquer gleaming beneath the cold sun. Yet when Henry and Eleanor stepped outside, the air was charged. Town eyes would be upon them today. Isabel remained behind, as servants always did, but she felt the weight of the moment from the parlor windows. The family's presence at church had always been ceremonial, a show of respectability. But today it was something more, a test. She watched Henry help Eleanor into the carriage, his hand steady, his face unreadable. Eleanor's chin was lifted high, but her movements betrayed a tension Isabel had never seen before. In town, pews filled quickly. Whispers began the moment the Whitfords entered the chapel. Men glanced from beneath lowered brows. Women leaned closer to one another, their voices thin as lace. Eleanor's eyes darted across them, searching for a sign of allegiance, but found only guarded stares. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, the white of her knuckles visible against black gloves. Henry sat firm beside her, his expression carved from stone. Clara leaned forward, her gray eyes fixed on the hymn book, as if determined to drown the murmur of adults with her own small act of attention. When the minister rose to speak, his words carried more weight than scripture alone. "A house," he intoned, "cannot stand divided. Pride brings downfall, while humility brings grace." Heads nodded throughout the congregation. No names were spoken, yet the message clung to the air with unmistakable clarity. Eleanor felt the sting of it, and her breath quickened beneath the watchful gaze of her neighbors. By afternoon, word had spread that the sermon had been meant for them. Some claimed the minister was sympathetic to Henry, others that he had quietly sided with Eleanor. The truth mattered little. Perception had taken root, and perception, Isabel knew, was soil where judgment thrived. At the estate, she polished the silver with measured strokes, but her thoughts wandered. Each clang of metal against cloth reminded her of voices in the market, of Mr. Alden's remark at the dinner, of Eleanor's bitter words. Perception destroys more lives than lies ever could. Isabel had no wish to become a symbol, yet she felt herself being fashioned into one regardless. That evening, Henry called her into the study. The fire burned low, throwing shadows across his features. Papers lay stacked, letters unopened. He did not sit behind the desk, but stood by the mantel, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have seen how matters have grown," he said. His voice was calm, though weariness pressed through it. This house is spoken of not for its work or its legacy, but for scandal. They use your name in their whispers, though you are blameless. I cannot undo what was done, but I must ask, can you endure it? Isabel hesitated. Her voice was barely more than breath. I have endured worse, sir, but I fear for what it may do to you, and to Clara. Henry's eyes softened. Clara is stronger than she appears. As for me, reputation can be rebuilt. But for you, he paused, searching for words. For you, it may either break you or set you free. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward. Isabel's gaze lingered on the flames. She had lived all her life bending beneath the weight of others. But now, standing in this room, she felt the possibility of something she had never allowed herself to imagine. Standing upright. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the hall. Eleanor entered without knocking. She looked pale, her gown immaculate, but her eyes sharp. She ignored Isabel entirely, turning to her husband. Do you not see? Your protection of her only worsens the gossip. If you dismiss her, it will end. If you do not, our family will be ruined. Henry's reply was calm but unyielding. I will not cast out the innocent to satisfy the cruel. Eleanor's voice cracked. And what of me? Am I to live branded by one mistake? Will you let her existence erase mine? The silence that followed pressed against Isabel's ribs. She wanted to leave, to vanish, but Henry's eyes held her still. He looked at his wife, his tone measured. No one erases you but yourself. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment she seemed about to speak again. Instead, she turned sharply and left, the door closing with a thud that echoed in the chamber. Henry exhaled. You see the path before us. Isabel lowered her gaze. It is dangerous. Yes, he said, but silence has become more dangerous still. That night, Isabel lay awake in her attic room. The jacket still hung in her wardrobe, its weight pressing down even from a distance. She thought of the chapel sermon, of Eleanor's plea, of Henry's defense. She thought of Clara's drawing, the small figure on the bridge. What am I to become? She whispered into the dark. The wind rattled the window panes as though the house itself replied. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. A letter arrived from Henry's sister, warning that invitations to winter balls had been rescinded. A merchant in town demanded stricter terms for his contracts, citing instability of household affairs. The Whitford name, once shield, had become vulnerability. Through it all, Isabel continued her work. She dusted mantles, laundered linens, carried trays. Yet each step felt heavier, as though she walked with eyes upon her even when she was alone. One afternoon, Clara slipped into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed from running. Papa says there may be a meeting soon, she whispered. A gathering at the estate. He says you must be present. Isabel's hands stilled on the dish she was drying. Me? Why? Clara's voice dropped. Because they will not believe him alone. They must see you. The dish slipped, clattering against the basin. Isabel caught it just before it shattered. Her heart pounded. To be seen was to be judged. To be seen was to risk everything. Yet the seed planted on that night, the seed that whispered silence was not enough, had begun to grow. As dusk fell, Isabel stood at her small window, watching the lanterns flicker along the garden path. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes storms. She knew a moment was coming when her choice would matter. She could remain the silent shadow she had always been. Or she could step forward into the dangerous light, where perception could wound, but where dignity might at last be claimed. The night pressed close, and in that stillness, Isabel realized she was no longer invisible. The world was watching. The invitation went out quietly, but the effect was thunder. By the week's end, the Whitford estate was set to host a gathering of merchants, neighbors, and church elders. Officially, it was a dinner to mend ties. In truth, it was a tribunal in disguise. The town had grown restless with whispers, and the family sought to steady the crumbling ground beneath them. Servants moved through the halls preparing the house, polishing floors until they gleamed, arranging flowers in tall glass vases, setting long tables with crystal and china. Yet beneath the ritual of preparation ran a current of unease. Every clink of glass sounded sharper, every footstep echoed longer. The walls themselves seemed to brace for judgment. Isabel worked with practiced hands, but her heart beat heavy. Mrs. Porter tried to reassure her in hushed tones. "They will not harm you, child. These are people who thrive on talk. Nothing more." But Isabel knew better. Talk could wound deeper than steel, and tonight she would be placed under its blade. On the evening of the gathering, lanterns glowed along the drive, casting soft halos over the gravel path. Carriages arrived one after another, wheels crunching against stone, horses snorting in the chill air. Guests stepped down in silks and wool, their faces half curious, half hungry for spectacle. Inside, Eleanor descended the staircase in a gown of deep blue velvet. She had dressed for war. Her hair was pinned high, her posture rigid, her smile brittle but unyielding. The humiliation of weeks past still burned in her, and tonight she meant to reclaim what she believed was hers. Henry greeted the guests with measured dignity, his voice calm, his gestures deliberate. Clara hovered near him, clutching her sketchbook like a shield, her eyes darting between adults with the sharp perception of youth. Isabel remained in the background, carrying trays, pouring wine, clearing plates. Yet she felt every glance land upon her. She was no longer unseen. She was the center of a story told in half-truths and rumors, and everyone had come to witness the living proof of it. The meal passed in strained civility. Conversations fluttered like nervous birds, landing briefly on business, shifting quickly to safe topics. But beneath the surface, tension coiled tighter with each course. Finally, Reverend Hale, seated near the head of the table, cleared his throat. His voice carried across the room with the authority of the pulpit. "Brother Whitford, there is unease in this community. People question the order of your household, the strength of your name. Perhaps it is time for clarity." The room hushed. Forks rested against plates. All eyes turned to Henry. He rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the candlelight. "Clarity is welcome," he said evenly. "For too long, silence has allowed lies to spread. Tonight, let truth be spoken plainly." Eleanor's hand clenched against the tablecloth. She had long feared this moment. Henry's gaze moved across the room, steady, unflinching. What happened in this house was not the fault of the one accused by whispers. It was cruelty visited upon her by another. If blame must be laid, let it rest where it belongs. Gasps rippled across the table. Eleanor's face flushed crimson. "You mean to shame me before them all?" she hissed. Henry's voice was quiet, but the weight of it pressed into every ear. "I mean to speak what is right. Respect must not be withheld because of status. Dignity belongs to all." The words hung in the air. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to commit. Then Reverend Hale's eyes turned toward Isabel. "And what say you, child? You have been silent while others speak for you. Do you confirm this account?" The room stilled. Dozens of eyes bore into her. Isabel's hands trembled around the tray she carried. All her life, silence had been her armor. To speak was to expose herself. To remain quiet was to let others decide her story. Her throat felt dry, but she lifted her chin. Her voice was soft, but clear. "I came into this house to work, not to be seen. I have polished silver, laundered linens, swept floors. I never sought to stand above my place, but I did not deserve the hand that tore my uniform, nor the words that followed. I am no threat to this family, except in the imagination of those who choose not to see me as I am." A murmur spread through the guests. Some looked startled, others ashamed. Clara's eyes shone with quiet pride, and Henry's expression softened with relief. Eleanor rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Enough of this performance. You all sit there judging me while she—" Her voice cracked, and for the first time uncertainty flickered across her face. She saw in the guests' eyes not support but doubt. Her power, once absolute in social circles, had slipped through her grasp. Reverend Hale lifted a hand, silencing the room. "Truth, when spoken with humility, carries its own strength. We have heard enough to judge fairly." The gathering ended not with applause or condemnation, but with a heavy silence that spoke louder than either. Guests departed quietly, their expressions unreadable. Yet as they filed into carriages, Isabel sensed the story had shifted. No longer was she merely the servant humiliated at a dinner. She was now the woman who had spoken when silence was expected. After the last carriage rolled away, the house stood still. Eleanor retreated to her chambers without a word. Henry lingered by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Clara approached Isabel, her voice trembling with awe. "You spoke," she whispered. Isabel nodded, though her hands still shook. "Yes, I spoke." She climbed to her attic chamber later, her body weary, her spirit trembling. The jacket still hung in her wardrobe, but tonight she did not look at it. Instead, she sat at the small desk and wrote on a scrap of paper, her words unsteady but certain. Silence no longer protects, it only hides. The candle flickered low, casting her shadow against the wall. For the first time, Isabel saw her shadow not as small, but as tall as the room itself. The Whitford estate had not been healed, division still cut through its walls, but something irreversible had taken place. Isabel was no longer a shadow. She had stepped into the light, and the light would not let her go. Winter deepened over the Whitford estate. Frost spread like lace across window panes, and the gardens lay brittle beneath a pale sun. The house, though still grand, seemed altered by the weight of what had unfolded. Its silence was no longer the silence of order, but the silence of reckoning. Isabel moved through the halls with steady grace. She felt eyes upon her still, but not in the way of whispers alone. The servants greeted her with a respect edged with awe, as though her voice at the gathering had lifted her into a place beyond her uniform. She did not seek it, but she carried it nonetheless. Eleanor rarely left her chambers now. Curtains remained drawn, mirrors covered with cloth. Her footsteps echoed in restless circles, her voice sometimes breaking in sharp whispers only she could hear. Pride had once armored her, but now it trapped her. She feared leaving the estate, feared the eyes of those who once applauded her. In solitude, her power shrank until even her reflection seemed like a stranger. Henry bore the burden of consequence. Letters continued to arrive, some with sympathy, others with veiled reproach. Contracts faltered, investments slipped away. He sat late into the night in his study, ink staining his fingers, the fire burning low as he measured the cost of silence and the price of truth. Yet Clara, untouched by the politics of reputation, thrived in her own way. She lingered near Isabel, sketching more often, her drawings sharper, braver. One evening, she placed a page in Isabel's hands. It showed 3 figures, a woman in velvet, a man by the fire, and between them, a smaller figure standing upright, not bowed. "That is you," Clara whispered. Isabel traced the lines with trembling fingers. "I am no more than I was before." Clara shook her head. "You are more because you did not hide." The words settled into Isabel like a seed finding soil. In town, the story shifted again. Some condemned Eleanor as cruel, Others pitied her as undone by jealousy. Many admired Isabel's courage, though they spoke of it in hushed tones, as if too much praise for a servant might unravel the order they lived by. Yet quietly, small acts of recognition began to appear. The baker's wife, who once averted her gaze, pressed an extra loaf into Isabel's basket. The banker's clerk tipped his hat as she passed. These gestures, small but deliberate, spoke of change, however fragile. One evening, Henry called Isabel to the library. The firelight cast his features in shadow, his hands clasped before him. On the desk lay an envelope sealed in red. "This," he said, "is a recommendation. For study, should you wish it. There are schools in the city that would take you, if I place my name beside yours." Isabel froze. The words felt impossible. Education had always been a distant horizon, glimpsed but unreachable. Now it lay before her, fragile as glass. "I cannot accept," she whispered. "It is too much." Henry's gaze was steady. "It is not charity. It is acknowledgement. You carry more within you than this house can contain. Do not let silence chain you again." Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. The wax seal pressed against her palm like a brand. That night, she walked through the garden, the winter air sharp against her face. Snow crunched beneath her shoes. She thought of Eleanor's bitter words, of Clara's unwavering eyes, of Henry's quiet conviction. She thought of her grandmother, long buried, who had taught her that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. At the edge of the fountain, she paused. The water had frozen over, a sheet of ice reflecting the stars. She saw her face in it, framed by darkness, her breath clouding the image. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe she might step beyond these walls, beyond the role given to her. Days later, Eleanor emerged from her chamber. She descended the staircase slowly, her frame thinner, her face drawn. The household stilled at the sight. Isabel stood at the bottom, tray in hand. Their eyes met. Eleanor's voice was brittle but clear. "Do you hate me?" Isabel shook her head. "No, madam." "Then why do you not leave? Why do you remain where you are not wanted?" Isabel's answer was quiet, but it filled the hall. "Because dignity is not granted. It is lived, and even here I will not surrender it." For a moment, Eleanor's composure cracked. She turned away, her hands trembling against the banister. She did not reply, but something in her gaze softened, resentment giving way to recognition, if only briefly. Spring approached. The frost receded, and the estate's gardens stirred with color once more. Isabel prepared her belongings with care, the folded uniform, the well-worn shoes, the envelope with its red seal. Clara wept when she learned Isabel would leave for the city, but she understood. She pressed a final drawing into Isabel's hand, this one of a bird in flight, wings spread wide above a house with tall windows. Henry met Isabel at the carriage. "Whatever the world says, remember this. You are not defined by whispers." She bowed her head in gratitude, the words caught in her throat. As the carriage rolled away, she looked back once. The estate stood tall against the sky, its windows glinting with the morning sun. Within its walls, division still lingered, but something had shifted. Judgment had been spoken, redemption had been sought, and silence had been broken. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, yet Isabel carried herself upright, her hands steady, her gaze forward. She had been torn down, but she had not been undone. And in the quiet rhythm of the wheels against the earth, she felt it, the truth she had whispered to herself, now alive in her bones. Dignity cannot be taken, only lived.